Imagine a small town nestled between rolling hills, its streets lined with banners that read, "All voices heard, all views welcomed." For decades, it thrived as a beacon of diversity, hosting debates on everything from climate policy to art. Then, a group arrives advocating for the suppression of dissent. They demand the right to protest enemies of progress, and the town, true to its creed, grants them a platform. At first, their speeches are passionate but harmless. Over time, however, they grow louder, more aggressive. They begin to harass those who disagree, then to incite violence. The town council debates: should we ban their intolerance or remain true to our principle of tolerance? If they ban the group, they violate their values. If they don't, their values erode. This is the paradox of tolerance, a contradiction at the heart of liberal democracy. It asks, can a society that practices absolute tolerance survive if it permits groups that seek to destroy tolerance itself? The paradox was articulated by philosopher Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. Popper, a refugee from Nazi Germany, argued that a liberal society must tolerate nearly everything, except intolerance. Popper's argument: 1. Liberalism's ideal, a society that values freedom of speech, assembly, and belief. 2. The intolerant group, a faction that seeks to end liberal values, e.g. by banning dissent, imposing ideology or violence. 3. The contradiction: to remain tolerant, the society must suppress the intolerant group. Popper's solution was pragmatic. If we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. The paradox is not a flaw but a necessary tension. A society that refuses to draw any boundaries risks its own demise. Exploration of implications. The paradox of tolerance is more than an abstract dilemma. It is a lived reality in every democracy. 1. The dilemma of liberalism. Popper's paradox forces liberals to confront their own limits. A society that champions free speech must decide whether to allow speech that undermines free speech itself. This is not theoretical. Nazi groups and democracies often test these boundaries. Online platforms struggle to moderate hate speech without becoming censors. 2. The tyranny of the majority. The paradox reveals a hidden danger. Intolerance can be majority-driven. Consider a democracy where a popular movement demands restrictions on minority beliefs. Tolerating this majority's intolerance erodes the very tolerance they claim to support. 3. Historical precedents. Weimar Germany. Intellectuals who tolerated fascist rhetoric as free speech enabled its rise. Modern examples. Social media algorithms amplify divisive content, creating echo chambers that radicalize users. 4. The role of power. Who decides what constitutes intolerance? Governments, corporations, or mobs? This question is fraught. Censorship risks authoritarian overreach. Laissez-faire tolerance can enable oppression, e.g., allowing hate speech that incites violence. 5. Legal and ethical boundaries. Hate speech laws. Countries like Germany criminalize Holocaust denial, balancing tolerance with protection. Cancel culture. Critics argue it weaponizes tolerance to silence dissent, while supporters see it as defending marginalized voices. 6. The illusion of neutrality. The paradox shows that no society is truly neutral. Even tolerance requires choosing what to tolerate, a decision that inherently excludes. This mirrors the paradox of choice. Segment 16. Freedom requires constraints. 7. The ethical tightrope. Utilitarianism. Ban intolerance to preserve societal harmony. Deontology. Uphold free speech even if it harms, as the principle itself is sacred. Communitarianism. Protect the community's values by limiting extreme views. 8. The comfort of pragmatism. Popper's solution is a pragmatic one. Tolerate nearly everything but draw a line at intolerance. This is messy but necessary. A democracy that protects free speech must also protect its ability to protect free speech. 9. The paradox of identity. Inclusion can become exclusionary. A university that bans hateful groups risks being called intolerant, yet allowing such groups may alienate students. The line between diversity and safety is ever shifting. 10. The cosmic scale of balance. The paradox mirrors the liar paradox. Segment 12. A system that allows self-destruction cannot survive. A tolerant society must, paradoxically, be intolerant of intolerance to stay tolerant. The paradox of tolerance asks, can a society survive without limits? Quantum immortality asks, can a consciousness survive without death? Imagine a physicist who believes consciousness collapses quantum states. In a branching universe, every death you experience might shift your awareness to a surviving branch. This is quantum immortality, a thought experiment where death becomes a subjective illusion. Like the paradox of tolerance, it deals with boundaries, one about societal survival, the other about personal existence. Both suggest that survival requires excluding certain realities, whether intolerant ideologies or the perception of death. The tolerant society must reject intolerance to survive. The immortal consciousness rejects death to persist. Both are paradoxes of self-preservation through self-limitation. As we turn to quantum immortality, we shift from the societal scale to the personal. The paradox of tolerance asks, what must we exclude to endure? Quantum immortality asks, what must we ignore to live forever? Together they frame existence as a dance between inclusion and exclusion, survival and oblivion. Expanded exploration of the paradox of tolerance. The anatomy of intolerance. The paradox forces us to define intolerance. Is it only violence or does it include speech? Consider the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Brandenburg v. Ohio, 1969, which protected hate speech unless it incites imminent lawlessness. This draws a line, but it's a fragile one. Case study: the Nazi Party in Skokie, 1977. When the American Nazi Party sought to march through a predominantly Jewish suburb, courts ruled in their favor, upholding free speech. Critics argued the march was intolerant and should be banned. The paradox arose. Was the court's tolerance of intolerance a betrayal of its values? The illusion of neutrality. The paradox reveals that tolerance is not passive. It requires active defense. A society that claims neutrality while allowing intolerant groups to grow risks becoming intolerant itself. This mirrors the Sorite's paradox. Segment 11. One intolerant act may not doom a society, but 1,000 such acts can. The ethical tightrope. Moral absolutism. Tolerating all except intolerance. But who defines intolerance? A government that bans extremist ideologies risks becoming authoritarian. Moral relativism. Tolerates all views, even those that seek to end tolerance. This risks the society's collapse. The role of power dynamics. The paradox is not evenly applied. Marginalized groups often demand tolerance for their existence, while powerful groups weaponize tolerance to suppress dissent. For example, free speech versus safety. A protest group advocating for LGBTQ+ rights versus one advocating for their oppression. Both claim tolerance. The illusion of infinite freedom. Like the paradox of choice, segment 16, the paradox of tolerance shows that freedom requires constraints. A town that tolerates all voices may lose its voice to the loudest, most intolerant ones. The comfort of pragmatism. Popper's solution is pragmatic, not perfect. It accepts that some lines must be drawn, even if arbitrarily. A society that bans hate speech isn't intolerant, but strategically tolerant, preserving the system that allows tolerance itself. The paradox in practice. Social media moderation. Platforms like Facebook face backlash for removing hate speech, yet allowing it risks enabling extremism. Universities. Free speech zones versus safe spaces. Both claim to uphold tolerance but clash in practice. The illusion of perfection. The paradox reveals that no system is flawless. Even in a tolerant society, exclusion is inevitable. The question is what to exclude and who holds the power to decide. The ethical dilemma of power. The paradox challenges the notion of pure liberalism. To survive, a society must sometimes act in ways that seem intolerant. This mirrors the trolley problem. Segment 7. Is it better to ban a group, actively intolerant, or risk their dominance, passively intolerant? The cosmic scale of survival. The paradox parallels the halting problem. Segment 14. A system, society, must limit itself to sustain itself. Just as a program cannot decide its fate, a society cannot remain absolutely tolerant without self-destruction. Transition to the next segment. The paradox of tolerance asks, how much exclusion is needed to preserve inclusion? Quantum immortality asks, how much denial is needed to preserve consciousness? Imagine a physicist who believes consciousness chooses survival in quantum branching. When faced with death, their awareness shifts to a surviving branch, making death subjectively impossible. This is the paradox of tolerance's parallel. To endure, a consciousness excludes death's reality, just as a society excludes intolerance. Both paradoxes frame existence as a selective process. The tolerant society excludes certain ideologies. The immortal consciousness excludes certain realities. The question is always, what must we reject to persist? As we turn to quantum immortality, we shift from societal survival to personal immortality. The tolerant society's boundaries and the immortal consciousness's denial both suggest that existence requires exclusion, even of its own contradictions. This expansion weaves the paradox of tolerance into a meditation on societal ethics, power dynamics, and the limits of freedom. It avoids bullet points by using narrative and philosophical exploration, maintaining the reflective tone. The transition bridges seamlessly to quantum immortality by contrasting societal exclusion with personal denial.